When I noticed my husband's reflection in the kitchen window, I didn't realize at first what he was holding. It wasn't until he stepped into the light that I saw my phone in his hand. My stomach tightened. Not because of guilt, at least not at that moment, but because I couldn't remember if I had deleted those messages. The ones I told myself I'd erase, and then didn't. The ones I read over and over at night when the house was quiet and the loneliness in my chest rang louder than his snores beside me. He turned the screen toward himself, swiped up, and his eyes began scanning. I stayed frozen, as if movement might crack the fragile illusion that everything was still normal. But it wasn't. With each passing second, I watched his brow crease, his breath slow, his thumb pause, scroll, pause again. Then he stopped entirely. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. I felt the blood leave my face. My body was here in the room, but my thoughts had spiraled into that one memory, that one decision I made 3 months ago. My phone vibrated in his hand. A new message. He read the name of the sender, and I saw his whole body stiffen. My mouth went dry. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit from childhood, when fear took over and I had no words. Now, I still had no words. He looked at me. Just looked. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever happened next would change everything. But if I'm going to tell you this story, I have to start where it truly began. Before the text messages, before the silence, before the storm that changed me. Let me take you back, so you understand exactly how I got here. It started in a moment so small, I might have missed it had I not been so desperate to feel something again. We had just come back from the grocery store, my husband, quiet as always, loading bags from the trunk while I unlocked the door. I don't remember what we talked about on the drive home, because I don't think we said anything at all. That silence wasn't new. It had become the background music of our life. When we entered the kitchen, I went about the motions, sorting, washing, storing, while he disappeared to his office. That was our routine. Efficient. Predictable. Numb. I was halfway through slicing tomatoes when I heard the front door creak again. I turned, expecting him. Instead, it was his son. My stepson. He'd returned earlier that day after years living abroad. Said it was temporary, just until he found his own place. He looked different, taller, broader, confident in a way he hadn't been before. His presence was quiet but felt deeply. I hadn't lived with him since he was in high school. Back then, I was just his father's wife, and he had been a polite, distant teenager. Now, he was a man. And I didn't quite know who I was anymore. He offered to help with the bags I hadn't finished unpacking. I nodded, grateful for the company, though I didn't say so. He moved next to me, reaching for the cucumbers. Our hands brushed. I flinched slightly, not because it startled me, but because it didn't. It felt natural. Warm. Human. We continued in silence, shoulder to shoulder. And I realized I hadn't been that close to someone in weeks. My husband and I had our routines, our habits, our shared responsibilities, but closeness? That had evaporated over time, like water left out in the sun. Later that evening, my husband fell asleep in his chair, glasses still on, remote balanced on his thigh. I sat across from him, book in hand, not really reading. I glanced toward the hallway. My stepson's door was slightly ajar, light still on. A shadow moved behind it. My heart beat a little faster. I told myself it was from the coffee I drank too late. The next morning, I woke early, the way I always do now. Not from rest, but from restlessness. I padded into the kitchen and made tea. He entered soon after, barefoot, hair tousled, t-shirt slightly askew. "Morning," he said. His voice had changed. Deeper. Gentle. I returned the greeting and offered him tea. He accepted. We stood at the counter like two people waiting for something to happen but unwilling to make the first move. I asked how he'd slept. He said he couldn't adjust to the time zone. I said I hadn't slept well either. He looked at me, and I mean truly looked, eye contact that lingered past politeness. I looked away first. My hand trembled just slightly as I lifted the mug. Later that day, we both ended up in the garden. The small wooden fence needed repair, and he offered to help. I grabbed the tools, and we worked together in silence, under a sky heavy with clouds. It was there, among the damp earth and rotting wood, that I felt something shift. Not in him. In me. He reached for a nail, and his hand grazed my wrist. I didn't move. I let it stay. Only for a second, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that my skin could still feel. That I hadn't gone completely numb. He looked up, catching my gaze. "You okay?" he asked. Just 2 words, but they meant something different in his tone. I nodded. Lied. That night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at a reflection I no longer recognized. My hair was pinned back, my shirt too loose, my eyes too tired. But beneath that fatigue was something else, something that hadn't stirred in years. I opened the drawer where I kept the silk robe. The one I hadn't worn in ages. I put it on, not for anyone else, not for him, but for me. To remember the woman who used to feel beautiful. Desired. As I walked down the hallway, I passed his door again. Still ajar. Still light inside. My husband, asleep in the living room. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tapping of rain beginning on the windows. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I was doing or why. Then I returned to my room, closed the door, and let the silence answer for me. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling. My body was motionless, but my thoughts twisted and turned beneath my skin. The memory of that touch, that glance, looped on repeat like a quiet confession I hadn't said out loud yet. I wasn't in love. Not then. Not yet. But I had crossed an invisible line. Not with my body. But with my mind. And it terrified me. The morning after felt strange, not because anything had happened, but because something almost had. There was a new tension threaded into the fabric of our house, subtle, but unmistakable. It clung to the air like the scent of yesterday's rain, and I carried it with me into the kitchen, into my clothes, into every breath. I poured myself a cup of coffee and tried to act normal, though I wasn't quite sure what that looked like anymore. My husband sat at the dining table, reading the news on his tablet, occasionally nodding or mumbling in response to headlines. I watched him for a long time, wondering how 2 people could share space so easily while feeling so far apart. It wasn't that he was cruel or inattentive on purpose. He simply no longer looked at me in the way he used to. His glances had become utilitarian, checking for something, confirming it was still there, then moving on. I often wondered if he even noticed when I wore a new shirt or changed my hairstyle. The answer, more often than not, was no. The sound of a door opening pulled my attention down the hallway. He emerged wearing a clean t-shirt, still damp at the collar from a shower. His hair was wet, combed back loosely, and his expression unreadable as he walked past us toward the fridge. I tensed. Not because he was doing anything unusual, but because my body now registered his presence differently. I hated that I noticed how his shoulders moved, how his voice sounded a bit hoarse in the morning, how he always smelled faintly of something citrusy after a shower. These were details I had no right to observe, yet I couldn't unsee them anymore. He greeted us both with a casual morning. I nodded, careful not to let my eyes linger, careful not to let anything show. But I knew. And maybe he did too. The rest of the day passed like a whisper, each moment padded with a kind of quiet uncertainty. I busied myself with cleaning the guest room, folding laundry, organizing spice jars, anything to fill the silence that was starting to feel heavier than noise. In the afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror again. I wasn't inspecting my face or smoothing my clothes. I was simply there. Staring. Not at how I looked, but at the woman behind the reflection. Who was she? Was she a wife? A mother figure? A woman on the edge of something she couldn't quite name? That evening, my husband said he had a meeting call and would be working late in his office. I nodded and cleared the dinner plates. The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies small sounds: running water, the click of cutlery, the creak of the floorboards. He appeared again as I was finishing up. This time, he lingered in the doorway, watching me rinse a pan. "You cook a lot," he said simply. I looked over my shoulder. "I guess so." There was a pause, one of those pauses thick enough to say what neither of us could. "I forget sometimes," he added, "how much you do around here." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "It's just habit." He didn't answer. Just nodded and disappeared back down the hallway. And I stood there, staring at the now clean sink, wondering why that moment meant more to me than it should have. After drying my hands, I stepped outside into the garden. It had rained earlier, and the air was still cool, still fragrant with soil and leaves. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the fence he'd helped me repair the day before. I walked slowly, taking it all in. This was my sanctuary, my piece of control in a life that often felt dictated by routine. I bent down to pluck a few weeds from the flower bed when I heard footsteps behind me. He had followed me out. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside me in silence. We both looked out over the small patch of green. The quiet between us wasn't heavy. It wasn't even uncomfortable. It just was. "Do you ever think about starting over?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I turned to him, surprised. "Starting over?" "Not necessarily running away," he said. "Just choosing differently." The question hung in the air longer than I expected it to. I didn't know what he meant. Or maybe I did, and just didn't want to admit it. "I used to," I replied eventually. "But then life keeps going, and it gets harder to imagine doing anything else." He looked at me then, really looked. And I felt something in my chest shift again, the way it had the night before. Only now, it wasn't just about tension or attraction. It was about being seen. Truly seen. I started to walk back toward the house, needing to break the moment before it became too much. He followed. And as we reached the back door, it happened. We kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even particularly passionate. But it was real. It was silent and slow and full of things we hadn't said. As soon as it ended, I stepped back. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. He didn't respond. Just opened the door for me and let me walk in first. The gesture was simple, polite, and it made everything worse. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling again. My husband slept beside me, oblivious to the storm quietly growing within me. I listened to his breathing and wondered how many more nights I could keep pretending. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if I wanted to undo what had just happened or fall deeper into it. But I knew one thing with certainty: I had crossed another line. And this one didn't feel invisible anymore. The morning sun poured through the kitchen windows like nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had. I moved through the motions of my usual routine, making coffee, folding napkins, wiping crumbs from the counter, but each task felt strange, as though I was performing someone else's life. My hands worked out of habit, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, stuck in that moment on the porch. The moment we kissed. I hadn't spoken to him since. I hadn't even looked at him. I was afraid of what I might see in his eyes: confirmation, regret, desire, confusion. Maybe all of it at once. Or maybe worse, nothing. My husband sat at the kitchen table again, flipping through a magazine he probably wasn't reading. He asked if I needed anything from the store. I shook my head. His voice barely registered. Everything around me seemed dulled now, like I was walking through fog. I had kissed someone else. His son. And somehow, the house looked the same. The chairs hadn't moved. The floor still creaked in the same places. But I no longer belonged to this routine. I needed to breathe. I needed distance. So I walked to the garden. Not to do anything, not even to pretend I had a task there. Just to get away from the stillness inside. The moment I stepped outside, I felt relief wash over me. The sun warmed my arms. The air carried that early summer scent, fresh cut grass and damp soil. For a second, I imagined I could go back to yesterday. Before. I knelt to pull a few weeds near the rose bush when I heard the screen door open and close behind me. I froze, hoping it was my husband, hoping I wouldn't have to speak. But the footsteps were too light, too measured. It was him. He didn't come close. He stood a few feet away, watching. I could feel it. The tension between us was quieter now, more cautious, but still thick enough to fill the air between us. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the earth, even as my heart picked up speed. "I'm going into town later," he said quietly. "Do you need anything?" I shook my head again, barely audible. "No, I'm fine." There was a long pause. I could hear birds in the distance, and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. "Okay," he finally said, and turned to go. Only then did I look up, just in time to see his back disappearing into the house. I didn't feel relief. I felt hollow. Later that day, I met my friend for lunch. I hadn't planned to. She had called in the morning and said she was nearby, and I didn't want to raise any suspicions by saying no. So I agreed. We met at our usual cafe, a small place with checkered tablecloths and tired waitresses who always remembered our orders. We sat by the window. "You look different," she said as soon as we sat down. "Not bad. Just. I don't know. Brighter." I almost laughed. Brighter was not how I felt. If anything, I felt dimmer, as though the light inside me had shifted into a corner and was flickering, unsure if it wanted to stay on. "I'm tired," I said, which wasn't a lie. She didn't press. Not at first. We talked about her new job, her neighbor's never-ending construction, the same shallow things we always did to fill the space. But eventually, she circled back. "Is everything okay at home?" I hesitated, too long. "I mean, with him moving back in," she continued. "It must be a little awkward, right?" There was a sharpness behind her smile. She was fishing. Or maybe she already knew something. Maybe she had noticed the way I looked at him, or the way he looked at me. Maybe I hadn't been as careful as I thought. "It's fine," I said quickly. "We've all just been adjusting." She nodded, slowly, studying me. I reached for my glass of water, suddenly aware of the heat rising in my cheeks. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Had I looked different? Had I acted different? Was I that obvious? Back home, the silence of the house greeted me like a familiar ache. My husband wasn't there. He had left a note on the counter saying he'd be working late. I wasn't surprised. He'd been working late more and more. Or maybe he just didn't want to come home early anymore. I walked through the rooms slowly, as if seeing them for the first time. The framed photos on the wall, the books on the shelf, the smell of his cologne still faint in the bedroom. All of it felt distant. Not mine. Not anymore. That evening, I found myself in the laundry room, folding clothes. His clothes. My clothes. His son's clothes. The ordinary fabrics of our lives all mixed together in one basket. I picked up one of his t-shirts, the son's, and paused. It smelled like him. Not strongly. Just enough. I stared at it for a long time before placing it gently on the pile. My fingers lingered. I told myself to stop, to focus, to be normal. But normal no longer made sense. I thought about the kiss again. About the way it had felt, wrong and right at the same time. About the silence that followed, heavier than any words. I didn't know if he was waiting for me to say something, or if he had already moved on in his mind, chalking it up to confusion or heat or impulse. But I hadn't. I carried it with me, like a hidden letter in my pocket, burning through the fabric. That night, I sat outside on the porch alone. The air was cool, the sky clear. I stared at the stars and let the silence settle over me. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. I wasn't even sure what I was afraid of. I heard the door open again. He stepped outside but didn't say anything. Just stood next to me, a few feet away, like before. We didn't talk. We didn't look at each other. But his presence said enough. We were still in the same house. Still pretending. Still walking the line. And the worst part? I wasn't ready to stop. The days that followed were slow, but not in the way time drags when you're waiting for something good. It was the kind of slow that seeps into your bones when you're unsure if you're hoping something happens, or praying that it doesn't. I spent more time in the garden, more time wiping already clean counters, more time watching the sky shift through the kitchen window. Everything I did felt like a performance. I smiled when my husband entered the room, answered his small talk with soft replies, and laughed at his predictable jokes, not because they were funny, but because I was afraid silence would raise suspicion. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to ask. What struck me the most was how natural the lie began to feel. The absence of confrontation gave me space to hide, and I took it willingly. I knew that if I slowed down even for a second, the weight of what I had done would crush me. So I moved. I cleaned. I folded. I organized. I kept going. He and I, the son, we avoided each other without speaking about it. That was the unspoken rule. If we didn't acknowledge it, it wouldn't become real. But the memory lingered between us, heavy and unsaid. And in a way, that silence was louder than any argument. Then came the day the car broke down. I had planned to run errands alone, just groceries, a few household supplies, a quick visit to the post office. Simple, ordinary things. But as I reached for my keys, my husband appeared in the hallway and casually mentioned he'd taken my car to work because his battery died again. He said it like it was no big deal, like I could just wait until the evening. Only I couldn't. I needed to leave the house. I needed air, movement, a place where I wasn't tiptoeing around guilt. Before I could think of a solution, he appeared again, his son, offering to drive me. His voice was even casual, as if nothing had ever happened between us. I hesitated, then nodded. Refusing might seem suspicious. The drive was quiet at first. The radio played softly, old songs I used to love but hadn't listened to in years. He didn't say much, and I was grateful. I kept my gaze on the window, pretending to admire the houses, the trees, the shifting light. Anything but him. But halfway to the store, the sky darkened. I hadn't even realized rain was coming until the first drops hit the windshield. Within minutes, the drizzle turned to a downpour. He turned on the wipers, but visibility dropped fast. "I'm going to pull over," he said, calm but firm. He turned off the main road and pulled into the side of an abandoned old lot where a small wooden garage stood, barely standing, but offering just enough shelter. He parked beside it and cut the engine. The rain hammered the car roof, loud and insistent. Inside, the air felt too still. I sat there, hands in my lap, unsure of what to do. My thoughts ran in too many directions. I knew I should say something, break the silence, bring us back to neutral ground. But I couldn't. He spoke first. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, not looking at me. "I won't do anything you don't want." I turned toward him. The sincerity in his voice startled me more than the words. I hadn't expected him to acknowledge it out loud. We had built our boundary in silence, after all. "I'm not afraid," I replied quietly. "I'm confused." He nodded, still watching the rain. "So am I," he said. There was no accusation in his tone. No pressure. Just truth. And that made it worse. I looked down at my hands, at the way my fingers twisted the hem of my sleeve. What was I doing? What was I hoping to find here, in this car, in this moment, in this complicated connection? I had no answer. But the fact that I was here, that I had agreed to this ride, that I hadn't pulled away after the kiss, that said more than I was willing to admit. Eventually, the rain softened. The storm passed as quickly as it came. But we stayed there, unmoving. "I should get those groceries," I murmured, reaching for the handle. He didn't stop me. Just started the engine and pulled back onto the road. At the store, we split up. I wandered the aisles slowly, taking more time than needed. I tried to focus on the list: eggs, milk, dish soap, but my mind kept returning to the way his voice sounded when he said he was confused. It wasn't just confusion. It was restraint. Pain, maybe. Or longing. Or guilt. Maybe all of it. Back in the car, we didn't talk. We didn't need to. There was an understanding now, unspoken, yes, but mutual. This thing between us wasn't an accident. It wasn't going away just because we ignored it. When we returned home, my husband was still out. The house greeted us with its usual quiet. I unpacked the bags, placed everything in its place. He lingered in the doorway, watching me. "Thank you for driving me," I said, my voice low but steady. He nodded once, then walked away. That night, I stood in the hallway outside my room and listened. My husband was asleep already, breathing slow and even. I looked toward the guest room, the door closed, the light off. I took one step forward, then stopped. Not tonight. Not yet. I went to bed and stared at the ceiling again. My life felt like a series of fragile dominoes, each choice threatening to knock down everything I had built. But I couldn't stop now. I was already moving. Already shifting. Already somewhere else entirely. I didn't know where this path would lead. But I knew I wasn't turning back. The days following the rainstorm were drenched in a strange stillness, like the air had settled into a kind of watchful waiting. Nothing happened, yet everything felt on the verge. Even the smallest sounds seemed amplified: the creak of the staircase, the clink of cutlery on a plate, the gentle rustle of wind through the garden leaves. It was as though the house had begun to listen, as though it knew. I did my best to stay busy. The linen closet got reorganized. The spice rack sorted alphabetically. I scrubbed the bathroom tiles until my knees ached. But no amount of order could fix what had started to fray inside me. Every motion was mechanical, every breath calculated. I was hiding inside normalcy. My husband didn't notice the difference. Or maybe he did, but chose not to see it. He had started working longer hours again, coming home with the same tired smile, asking about dinner, nodding politely to updates about errands. We were back in sync, if you could call it that, but only on the surface. Underneath, I was miles away. The son, his son, kept his distance. Or I kept mine. Or maybe it was mutual. We moved around each other with practiced grace, never staying in the same room for too long, never speaking unless necessary. But when our eyes met, even briefly, I felt something collapse in me, something wordless, heavy, and real. Then came the evening that changed everything again. It was late, nearly midnight. I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house in silence, barefoot on cool tile floors, hands trailing along the walls as though trying to tether myself to something solid. I paused by the back door, cracked it open, and stepped outside. The air was warm and wet from the day's humidity. The moon hung low, casting a silver glow over the grass. I stood on the porch, arms crossed against the thin fabric of my robe, listening to the quiet hum of crickets and the occasional creak of wood settling. Then I saw him. He was sitting on the edge of the garden, elbows resting on his knees, staring up at the sky. I didn't mean to approach. I didn't plan to. But my feet moved before my thoughts could catch up. When he heard me, he looked over, not startled, just aware. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, two people standing still while everything around them churned. I sat down beside him, careful to leave space between us. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I'd regret it. But I knew that staying away hadn't stopped anything. We watched the sky for what felt like hours. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loaded with memory, with hesitation, with the remnants of a kiss that hadn't left me since it happened. Eventually, he spoke. "I keep trying to forget it," he said quietly. "But it keeps coming back." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I was thinking the same thing. His voice was low, deliberate. "If you want me to leave, I will. I'll figure something out." I turned to him, surprised. "Why would you say that?" "Because I don't want to make things harder for you." The sincerity in his voice pierced something in me. I wanted to tell him that it was already hard, that every day I was unraveling a little more, that I was terrified and lost and unsure of who I was becoming. But I didn't have the words. Not then. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the distant silhouette of trees swaying in the breeze. "It's not about you leaving," I whispered. "It's about me not knowing how to stay." That was the truth. The hardest truth. I didn't know how to stay in my own life anymore. The roles I had worn for years of wife, caretaker, homemaker, no longer fit. They hung on me like someone else's clothes, too tight in some places, too loose in others. We sat in silence again. The space between us still there, but thinner now, like a line drawn in sand instead of stone. I turned to him and said, "We can't go back." His eyes met mine. "I know." And then it happened again. We kissed. Not rushed, not desperate, just honest. The kind of kiss that doesn't demand answers or promises. It simply acknowledges what already exists. When it ended, I leaned back, breathing deeply, trying to steady myself. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to add. The moment had spoken for itself. I stood up first. He remained seated, looking down at his hands. Inside the house, the clock ticked softly in the hallway. The lights were dimmed, the air still. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands trembled slightly as I brought it to my lips. I glanced toward the closed bedroom door. My husband was asleep on the other side, unaware of the fracture widening quietly beneath the roof we shared. I thought about waking him, about saying something, anything, but what would I say? That I no longer recognized myself? That I had crossed a line again? That part of me had wanted to? No. Not yet. Instead, I tiptoed into the guest bathroom, washed my face, and stared at my reflection. I didn't look like someone caught in an affair. I looked like someone caught in her own life. A woman who had followed every rule, met every expectation, and still ended up hollow. Back in bed, I lay perfectly still, watching shadows shift along the ceiling. My mind replayed the night over and over, not just the kiss, but the conversation, the silence, the weight of knowing. Tomorrow would come. There would be dishes to wash, laundry to fold, conversations to fake. I would put on the mask again, rehearse the lines, pretend the world hadn't tilted. But tonight? Tonight I stopped pretending. Morning arrived without warning. I opened my eyes to the soft gray light slipping in through the curtains, and for a moment, I couldn't place the weight in my chest. Then it all returned, last night, the porch, the kiss, the way I had lingered in his presence as if pulled by something invisible but undeniable. There was no more denying it. I was no longer just keeping a secret. I was living it. My husband had already left for work. His side of the bed was cold. A mug sat on the counter, rinsed but still faintly stained by the tea he drank every morning. A part of me wondered if he suspected anything. Another part, much louder, hoped he didn't. I moved through the morning in silence. I didn't see him, his son. I assumed he was either avoiding me or doing the same thing I was, hiding inside the rhythm of ordinary tasks. I didn't know which one I preferred. Maybe distance made this feel less real. Maybe closeness made it worse. Or maybe it didn't matter anymore. Later that day, I found myself in the attic, rummaging through old boxes. I told myself I was looking for the spring decorations I always put out this time of year, but that wasn't the truth. I just needed to be somewhere else, somewhere forgotten and quiet. I pulled open a box filled with photos, cards, and old travel brochures, remnants of a life built one trip, one plan, one moment at a time. I held a photograph of us, my husband and I, on our 5th anniversary. We looked happy. Not the kind of staged happiness you put on for strangers, but something genuine, something lived in. He was holding my hand. My eyes sparkled. I didn't recognize either of us anymore. What had happened to that version of me? The woman who laughed without guilt, who found joy in the simple rituals of being a wife? Somewhere along the way, I had become invisible to him, and eventually to myself. That evening, as I finished setting the table for dinner, I heard footsteps approaching. My breath caught, just for a second. But it was only my husband, loosening his tie, tired eyes blinking toward the smell of food. "Smells good," he said, almost absent-mindedly, as he sat down. I offered a small smile. We ate in near silence. He scrolled through his phone between bites. I didn't comment. This was our normal now. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to check on the laundry. I didn't need to. I just needed to get out of the room. I walked down the hallway slowly, let my fingers graze the walls again, grounding myself with small touches. As I passed the guest room, I paused. The door was cracked open, the light inside dim. I heard movement, soft, deliberate. A book being closed, maybe. A drawer being shut. I didn't step inside. I didn't even speak. But I stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, and I knew he felt me there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing shapes in the patterns above. The silence between my husband and me had grown so familiar that I could almost measure its weight. We shared a bed, but not warmth. We exchanged words, but not meaning. We lived together, but not as one. In the darkness, I heard my phone buzz. One message. I reached for it with hesitant fingers, already knowing who it was from. I opened it. "Can we talk?" "Just talk." I stared at the screen, heart thudding. I didn't reply. I set the phone down and sat up, unsure of what I was doing until I was already doing it. I walked down the hallway slowly, quietly, avoiding the one floorboard that always creaked. The guest room door was closed now. I raised my hand and knocked gently. A pause, then a quiet reply, "Come in." I entered and closed the door behind me. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, eyes cast downward. He looked up when I stepped forward, but didn't smile. Neither did I. For a long moment, we didn't speak. I sat in the chair across from him, my hands clenched in my lap. "This can't keep happening," I said, finally breaking the silence. "I know. We're not those people." "I never thought we were," he answered. His voice wasn't defensive. Just tired. I wanted to blame him, to say he had crossed a line first, but I couldn't. We had both walked into this, step by careful step. No one had pushed. No one had trapped. We had arrived here by choice, or maybe by neglect of the parts of ourselves that had long gone unheard. "I feel like I'm disappearing," I admitted. "And with you, I don't." He nodded. "Me too." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a confession of love. It was two people recognizing the same absence in their lives and mistaking the reflection of that emptiness in each other as something more. I stood up. "I need to go," I said. He didn't stop me. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, and I walked out of the room, closing the door gently behind me. Back in the bedroom, my husband stirred slightly as I climbed into bed. I watched him in the dark, studied his face as he slept. He looked older than I remembered. More fragile. And I wondered how much of that was real, and how much of it I was only just now noticing. I lay awake for hours, my thoughts churning in slow, aching circles. I had crossed a line. Twice. And no matter how carefully I tried to return to where I'd been, I couldn't unstep those steps. I couldn't unknow what it felt like to be seen again. To be asked what I was feeling. To be missed. The guilt didn't come in sharp waves. It settled like dust everywhere, invisible at first, then undeniable. It clung to my skin, my clothes, my breath. I carried it with me now. And yet, even with the weight of it, I didn't feel ready to let go. Not yet. Not fully. There was something still unfinished, something still unraveling. I didn't know what I would do tomorrow. But I knew the silence was no longer enough. The day began like all the others, with the sound of the kettle humming and the gentle creak of the floor under my feet as I moved through the kitchen. Light spilled in through the window above the sink, casting long shadows on the tiles. I stood there for a moment, just holding my mug, staring out at the garden. The grass had grown taller than usual. I hadn't trimmed it in over a week. I wasn't even sure why I noticed that now, maybe because I needed to think about something ordinary. Something safe. My husband sat in the dining room, reading the newspaper, as he always did. His plate was empty. He must have already eaten while I was still in the shower. I hadn't heard him. Lately, it felt like we moved through the house without ever quite intersecting. Like two lines running in the same direction but never touching. He looked up briefly, offered a small smile, and returned to the news. I gave him the same smile back. I'd gotten very good at those kinds of smiles, just enough to maintain the illusion. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of chores and half-finished thoughts. I folded laundry without remembering how I'd sorted it. I watered the plants on the windowsill, though they hadn't needed it. I moved from room to room like a ghost, searching for something I couldn't name. At lunchtime, I sat outside with a bowl of soup I barely touched. The sun was high, but the air still carried a coolness that clung to my arms. I listened to the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The world outside was alive, buzzing, unaware of the quiet war taking place inside my chest. He came out onto the porch, his son, with that same easy silence that had started to feel familiar. He didn't sit beside me, just leaned against the railing and looked out at the yard. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I was tired. But not from lack of sleep. It was the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. The kind that builds slowly when you spend too many days pretending nothing is wrong. "We don't have to talk," he said after a moment. "I just didn't want to ignore you." I appreciated that. He wasn't pushing. He never had. That was part of what made everything feel so dangerous. It wasn't manipulation or persuasion. It was quiet understanding. A recognition. And that was far harder to resist. Later that evening, my husband came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He stood behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. "I thought we could go out this weekend," he said casually. "Maybe take a drive, stay somewhere overnight." I froze, a plate still in my hands. "Just us," he added. "It's been a while." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice even. "That sounds nice." He smiled again, this time more genuine. "Good. Let's do it." After he left the room, I stared at the sink, water running over my hands. I should have felt relief, or happiness. Instead, I felt panic. It was the first time in months he'd made a suggestion like that. And now, just when things had gone too far. That night, I found myself unable to sleep again. I sat up in bed for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness. The ceiling fan spun slowly overhead, stirring the air but not the thoughts clinging to me. I looked at the clock, 1:24 a.m. I got up quietly, careful not to wake him, and padded down the hallway. The house was still. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more softly. I paused outside the guest room door, hand hovering just inches from the knob. I didn't knock this time. When he opened the door, he didn't look surprised. He stepped aside to let me in. We didn't speak. We spent the night together. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Light hadn't yet reached the windows. I dressed quietly, my heart thudding with a mixture of fear and something else, something I didn't want to name. I walked back to our bedroom and slipped under the covers just as the sky began to shift from black to gray. My husband stirred beside me but didn't wake. Lying there, I stared at the ceiling again, the same ceiling I had memorized night after night. Only this time, something had shifted. There was no going back. No pretending this was just a moment, a slip, a confusion. This was real. And now, I had to decide what to do with that truth. The morning after was colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in everything else, the air, the silence, the space between us. I moved around the kitchen with deliberate slowness, unsure of how to inhabit my body, unsure of how to carry this new version of myself in the same old house. Every drawer I opened, every plate I set on the table, felt like a betrayal of something I hadn't even named out loud. My husband came in not long after sunrise. He was already dressed for work, his shirt crisp, his tie perfectly aligned. He kissed me on the cheek without looking at me, a mechanical gesture that had once meant something but now passed between us like a transaction. I murmured something about his lunch being in the fridge. He nodded and left with a quick goodbye. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the sound of the silence settle again. It didn't comfort me anymore. I couldn't look at the guest room door as I passed it. I couldn't trust myself to not reach for something I had already taken too far. I went straight to the laundry room and began sorting clothes, though there weren't enough for a full load. I needed motion, noise, something to fill the growing ache inside me. Later that morning, I went to meet my friend at the cafe downtown. We hadn't planned it, but she had texted, and I couldn't say no without raising suspicions. I needed to appear normal. I needed to rehearse the part of the woman I used to be. She arrived already talking, her sunglasses perched on her head, her bag slung loosely over one shoulder. She spoke about her neighbor's dog, her aging mother, the chaos of traffic on the way over. I listened, nodded, smiled in all the right places. But the truth was, I heard very little of what she said. Then she looked at me, really looked, and tilted her head slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Just tired." She studied me a second longer, then reached for her coffee. "You've been saying that a lot lately." I wanted to laugh at how transparent I must have been. I wanted to cry at how little it had taken to unravel me. But instead, I asked about her garden. About her son. About anything that would keep the focus off of me. When I returned home, I found the house too quiet again. He wasn't there, his son. I checked the garage. His car was gone. I tried not to let the knot in my stomach tighten further. Maybe he had gone for a drive. Maybe he needed air. Maybe he was thinking the same things I was, and had finally found the courage to step away. But I didn't believe that. Not really. I wandered through the house, eventually ending up in the room we rarely used, an old study with books that hadn't been touched in years. I ran my fingers along the spines, dust lifting into the air with each movement. My gaze landed on a framed picture on the shelf, our wedding day. I was smiling in that photo. So was he. We looked young, not just in face, but in spirit. In belief. We had believed in each other. I sat down on the faded couch and stared at that photo for what felt like forever. In the late afternoon, I heard the front door open. I didn't move. I listened. Footsteps, hesitant. Not my husband, his were always quick, firm, predictable. These were slower. Searching. I didn't want to face him. I didn't want to look into his eyes and see reflection of my own regret. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. He found me in the study, still holding the frame. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, waiting. I set the photo down and finally met his eyes. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back," I said. He didn't answer right away. I needed to think. I nodded. "I know." There was a long silence. He didn't step further into the room, and I didn't invite him. We both stood in the thick of something unspoken, and neither of us dared to break it. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said quietly. He gave a sad smile. "Me neither." That was the closest either of us had come to naming it. What it was. What we had done. What we had become. He stepped back then, slowly, respectfully. "I'm going to stay at a friend's for a while," he said. "Just to give you space." And him. I didn't stop him. I didn't ask who the friend was, or for how long. I just nodded, because there was nothing left to say. After he left, I stood in the doorway and watched the road through the window. His car pulled away, turned the corner, and disappeared. I let the curtain fall. That night, my husband came home later than usual. He was tired, distracted. We ate in silence. I didn't ask where he had been. He didn't ask what I had done all day. We moved like two strangers caught in the same story, too far along to rewrite the beginning. As we got ready for bed, he looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, quiet suspicion, maybe. Or worse, acceptance. "You've seemed distant lately," he said. I paused, toothbrush in hand. "Just a lot on my mind." He nodded. "If there's something I should know." "There's nothing," I interrupted, too quickly. He didn't push. Just looked at me a second longer, then turned off the light. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I felt more alone than I ever had before. Not because he was far from me, but because I was far from myself. And the worst part was knowing I had put that distance there. With my own hands. The next morning arrived before I was ready for it. I opened my eyes to the pale gray light spilling across the ceiling, my mind already restless before my body had fully caught up. I lay there for several long minutes, listening to the soft rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me, wondering how long I could pretend that this version of life still fit. He stirred just as I sat up. Our eyes didn't meet. He mumbled something about work, about traffic, about needing to leave earlier than usual. I nodded. That was our new pattern, nodding, avoiding, carrying on. As if silence could patch what was already broken. When he left, the front door clicking closed echoed through the house with a finality that settled heavily in my chest. I moved through the morning like a machine, made coffee, cleaned the counter, watered the plants on the porch. But I wasn't really in the room. My mind was tracing yesterday's movements, his words, the way he had stood in the doorway of that study like a ghost haunting his own home. The house was too still now. With him gone and his son gone, I felt the hollowness take up space in every room. I walked through it slowly, as if retracing my own steps might lead to understanding how I had ended up here. But there were no answers, just echoes. Later in the afternoon, I drove out of the neighborhood. I needed to get away from the walls that remembered too much. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my hands seemed to know where to go. I ended up by the lake, the one we used to visit years ago, before the stress, before the silence, back when we were still trying. The parking lot was mostly empty. I got out and walked toward the water, gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The lake shimmered under the early sun, still and blue, framed by trees on all sides. I stood at the edge and breathed deeply, as if the wind might carry some of the weight away. A few ducks glided across the surface. I watched them for a while, envying their simplicity, their lack of conflict. Then I sat on a nearby bench and stared out, letting my thoughts drift. I thought about the versions of me that had existed here. The young woman who used to bring books and snacks, sit in the sun while he fished, ask questions about the future. The wife who brought sandwiches in a cooler, who shared quiet afternoons without needing to speak. And now, this. This version of me who came alone, searching for something she couldn't even name. It started to rain lightly. Just a few drops at first, barely noticeable, but steady. I didn't move. I let the rain touch my skin, as if it might wash away something buried deeper than guilt. Eventually, I stood up and returned to the car. I didn't go straight home. I drove around aimlessly for another hour, the radio low, windows fogged just enough to make everything outside look a little farther away. I felt like I had become a ghost in my own life, passing by places I used to know without being seen. When I finally pulled into the driveway, his car was there, my husband's. He was home early. Inside, the lights were on. I stepped through the door cautiously, unprepared for what I might walk into. But there he was, sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of papers, glasses on the bridge of his nose, a cup of tea in front of him. He looked up when I entered, gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You were out for a while," he said. "I needed air," I replied. He nodded and turned back to the papers. "Dinner's in the oven," he added, almost as an afterthought. It took me a few seconds to process that. He had cooked. He had waited. Or maybe not waited, but stayed. I walked to the counter, opened the oven, and found the meal he'd prepared, something simple, familiar. I stood there with the door open, the heat rushing out and warming my face. We sat down together at the table, eating in silence. At one point, he cleared his throat like he might say something, but instead reached for his glass and drank slowly. "I was thinking," he said finally, "maybe we could take that trip after all. The one I mentioned last week." I set my fork down. "You still want to go?" He shrugged. "If you do." I didn't answer right away. My thoughts were spinning. He was offering connection again, but I wasn't sure I could meet him halfway. Not after everything. Not with everything I was still carrying. "We'll see," I said eventually. He nodded, as if that was enough. Later that evening, I sat alone in the living room while he took a call in the other room. The house was dim now, the curtains drawn, the silence full again. I picked up my phone out of habit, not to call anyone, just to look. No new messages. Nothing unexpected. But something tugged at me. I scrolled through old messages, not his, but mine. Conversations I had buried, deleted, tried to forget. There was one still there, unread. From earlier that week. From him. It just said, "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. It felt like a period on something I wasn't ready to end. Or maybe it was the only sentence left that still felt honest. I didn't reply. Instead, I put the phone down and walked to the hallway. I passed the guest room, the doors still closed, the space still untouched, and continued toward the bedroom. My husband was there already, changing into his pajamas, setting his phone on the nightstand. He looked over as I entered. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah." We climbed into bed. He turned off the lamp. The room darkened, the ceiling disappearing above us. I lay there, staring into the silence. He reached over and took my hand, just lightly, gently, without words. And I didn't pull away. Not because I had forgiven myself. But because I wasn't ready to let go. Of anything. Not yet. Spring came slowly that year, as if the season itself was hesitant to bloom. The trees began to wake up with their pale green buds, the sky softened into longer, lighter afternoons, and birds returned to the fence outside our kitchen window. Everything around me seemed to be trying again. Starting over. Breathing. But inside the house, nothing felt renewed. We moved through the days with the same quiet rhythm, my husband and I. A shared cup of coffee in the morning. A short exchange about groceries. Questions about work, reminders about bills. The foundation of our life remained intact. But beneath it, the cracks were still there, silent, deep, and widening. He never asked where I had been that day I disappeared for hours. He never brought up the trip again. And I never asked why. We spoke in gestures more than words now. He would fix the squeaky door hinge, and I would fold his laundry before he asked. He would fill my gas tank, and I would leave his favorite tea on the counter in the morning. It was our way of trying. Or perhaps it was our way of avoiding the truth. I hadn't seen his son since he left. Weeks passed. At first, I looked for him on sidewalks, in grocery aisles, in the blur of passing cars. But eventually I stopped. Not because I forgot, but because looking hurt more than missing. He didn't write again. He didn't come back. Sometimes I caught myself replaying things that had happened, not to romanticize them, but to make sense of how quickly a life could split. I would stand in the garden and trace the exact steps of where we'd stood. The porch, the back fence, the space between us on rainy afternoons. It was all still there, but now it belonged to silence. One morning, I found a letter tucked between the pages of a book in the living room. The book was old, one I hadn't touched in years, and I knew it wasn't mine. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, neat, purposeful. I knew it before I even unfolded the page. There was no greeting. No signature. Just a few sentences. I left not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much. Staying would have made it worse. You don't owe me anything. But I'll always be grateful you saw me. And let me see you. I stared at the words for a long time, unable to move. Then I refolded the paper and placed it back where I found it, between the same two chapters. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was hiding, but because some truths don't belong to the world. They belong to the space between one breath and the next. They live quietly inside you, like a room with the door shut but not locked. A few days later, my husband asked if I wanted to plant new flowers in the garden. We hadn't touched the flower beds since last summer. I said yes. He bought soil and seeds. We worked together in the dirt, silent, side by side, hands busy with small, hopeful things. In the afternoon, I sat back on my heels and looked at what we'd done. The garden was simple, still unfinished, but it was something. A beginning, maybe. He looked at me then and asked, "Are you happy?" It was the first real question he'd asked in a long time. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what the right answer was. But I looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the tired weight in his shoulders, the kindness that still lingered despite everything, and I said, "I'm trying." That was the truth. Not joy, not resolution. Just effort. Just movement. That night, I took a walk alone. I followed the path behind our neighborhood, past the creek, past the benches, past the trees that were just starting to bloom. The air smelled like wet grass and new beginnings. I found a spot under a willow tree and sat down. The wind rustled the leaves above me, soft and steady. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I wasn't sure what came next. I wasn't sure who I was without the guilt. Without the ache. Without the weight of the decision I had made. But I knew I had changed. Not because of him. Not because of what we did. But because something in me had been cracked open, and through that crack, light had come in. A painful, necessary light that forced me to see things I had long ignored. My life was still mine. It didn't have to be anyone else's version of right or good or perfect. It didn't have to be judged against anyone's expectations. It just had to be honest. Slowly, steadily honest. When I returned home, the lights were still on in the kitchen. My husband was reading again, the same book he always claimed to finish but never did. He looked up and smiled when I entered. A small, weary smile. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled back, fully, not out of habit. Later that evening, I stood at the window and watched the wind move through the trees. I thought of everything I had lost. Everything I had risked. Everything I still carried. And I realized I wasn't running anymore. Not toward anything. Not away from anything. I was just here. Still. And that, somehow, was enough.